Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark LaLiberty, and joining me today is...
Corey Dancing Lemur Knocktrainer.
Okay, that was better than I was expecting.
I gave you enough. People will get enough of what you're expecting a little later.
On today's episode, we'll be discussing why Corey thinks lemurs are dancing. Before that, though, we will cover a recent rash of malware impacting an extremely popular computer game. And then we will end with our review of the Verizon data breach investigations report. With that, let's go ahead and cha-cha our way in, unfortunately. So let's start this week with some news around what used to be one of my favorite games. Corey, did you ever play Minecraft when it was still an old Java game?
I played it when it first came out, and I love and appreciate the game, but it's the game of my kids, so I mostly played it through them. To me, it's digital Legos for my kids' generation.
My foray into Minecraft was pre-Microsoft acquisition, where
For me too, when it was Java. Yeah.
Yep. Which it still is in one situation, as we'll see. But
I know Microsoft tried to get rid of it, but they still have it around.
You can still play the Java edition. That's one that supports mods, which foreshadowing. Whereas the Bedrock edition is more of Microsoft's rebuilt and like .NET, C# whatever. But anyways, so in the Minecraft community, if you use the old but still maintain Java version, it supports modifying the game. You can add your own, let's say, textures to it to make everything look like ultra sharp and 4K. You can add your own like items to the game, or even entire like modifications. There's no story in Minecraft, but you can add, like, as an example, story elements.
Basically, there is a story in the Bedrock edition, by the way. Now, isn't this that the key thing Microsoft added is a story mode? But no, I agree with you. Isn't there like mods that also defeat one of the cute novelties of Minecraft? Is its basic cute graphical nature, but they have beautifying ones where you can have ray trace reflected water. You can turn the blocks more into these highly textured, and suddenly it's this highly graphical game. But while I think mods are cool in general, I think that kind of defeats the whole purpose of the beauty and the simplicity of Minecraft.
But like other games, you can mod Minecraft, at least the Java version. And for the most part, there's two major websites that host these mod projects, for lack of a better word. CurseForge is one of the big ones. They're pretty big in a lot of modding communities, like World of Warcraft, Skyrim, all those. And then Bukkit, Bukkit, is the other big one that's more Minecraft specific, as you might guess. So just yesterday, as the time of recording this, I'm still follow a few like modding communities for like other games, and I noticed in those Discord chats and then on Reddit, people started pointing out that something fishy was going on in the Minecraft modding community, and they actually found what was effectively malware laced inside of a lot of really popular mods for Minecraft. They ended up naming it Fracturizer after the user that uploaded the most copies of this malware. And basically, there were reports from different mod authors that seemed to indicate someone had compromised their account, in some cases potentially bypassing multi-factor authentication, and use that access to inject this malicious code into existing mods. And many of these mods are included in what are called mod packs, basically bundles of really popular ones. As an example, there's a really popular one called Better Minecraft with over 4.6 million downloads. That one included some of these malicious mods rolled up into it. Now, pause for a second here before we get into the details of the malware and what exactly it does. There were indications that they were able to, some of these mod authors said they've got multi-factor authentication enabled. So that right off the bat, like, scenarios are what? Like a adversary in the middle style of attack that could let them circumvent MFA, a vulnerability that lets them get past MFA, or I know at least CurseForge supports API-based access for mod management as an author, and APIs generally don't have multi-factor authentication, so maybe that's an avenue.
API.
But either way, that's a bit concerning, where typically the guidance would be, oh yeah, they probably got their credential compromised, and if they had MFA, it would have been fine. But doesn't appear to be the case in these. Now,
by the way, just to be a pure devil's advocate, some of the mod authors claimed they had 2FA. I mean, if we're just adding all the things it could be, maybe it was just a claim. Maybe they didn't turn it on, and now they're embarrassed about not having turned it on. I'm not saying that's what it is. I actually think like you have perfectly demonstrated how phishing can do adversary in the middle attacks, and it's not really breaking the MFA, it's stealing a session cookie, and once you have the session cookie, MFA is long gone. So there's definitely ways you can bypass it.
Yep. So either way, like, this is less than 24 hours old as of our recording, so I'm sure by the time even this episode comes out, there will be some more details. But I wanted to chat about the malware because, all things considered, it's pretty dang amazing from a, like, I mean, it's terrible, it's malware, but from a research perspective, it's way different than what I've seen historically in like this class of malware targeting video game mods and things like that. Like, historically, when you see malware injected into a mod for a game, or even the game itself, like, oftentimes these threat actors will use like off the shelf malware and inject it in and just use it as is. Basically, there's not a lot of like custom malicious code writing for historically how these attacks typically work. That is not the case in this one. It seems to be rather like built from scratch effectively. Now, it's not as sophisticated in some ways as we'll get into, but it does look like someone took the time to basically write all this from scratch and then carry out this coordinated, pretty widespread attack within this community. As an example, so the malware itself, when it executes, so it executes by someone launching Minecraft with one of these malware laced mods installed. When that causes the malware to execute, it can actually self-replicate to any Java file, any jar file on the computer, period, Minecraft or not. If you happen to be like a Java application developer, it'll infect all of your other Java files as well too, which is
so. This, by the way, is I think the industry, including us, has started to just use malware because so many people don't. There's more specific terms for types of malware, like a worm versus a Trojan versus a virus. But it is accurate to say this is a true virus. I mean, the definition of a virus is a type of malware that spreads file to file on the local computer, not necessarily network to network. So I did notice, it's actually one of the first things I noticed when you shared this article was they start that this is a virus. And my first thing was, wow, I haven't seen anyone say virus for a long time. Is this just some dumb non-security person misusing the term? But this is literally a virus if it's self-replicating to different Java files on your computer.
It is the like perfect example of a traditional virus. You're right. Yeah. So the malware, the virus, whatever, it's multi-staged. So starting with stage 0, this is the malicious code that was injected into the main class for these Java projects. So basically, every Minecraft mod is its own little self-contained jar file, Java file, compiled Java
archive,
which has a main class that gets exported. The game will load that up and then basically can call other functions within that class. This is also why Minecraft modding is so powerful, because you can basically modify anything you want within the game using these new Java classes. So the malware author injected this little bit of malicious code into the main class, basically the main bit of code that gets executed first. It's got some basic obfuscation. It uses byte arrays that are then converted to strings throughout part of it. So instead of like function name and parameter, it's function name and then string from byte array of 08, 02, 44, whatever, to little bit of obfuscation, but pretty basic.
You call that basic, but that is, I would say that's medium basic. You know what I mean? Like, okay. we showed recently some shortcut link obfuscation where literally they were still trying to obfuscate that they were putting together a string that said something obvious, but they didn't put it in an array. They literally just took the words and made them individual variables that you had to, they just concatenated it right there. And if you have any basic understanding, you could literally still read the string as it was at least if you're putting it in an array, you have to do a little bit more work as a computer, someone reversing the code to figure it out. But I get that it is true that even that is simple obfuscation compared to the crazy encrypted stubs and things they can do now. So, but yeah,
Yep.
fun
So
stuff.
basically, that injected little bit of code, it creates a URL class loader, which is a type of function in Java that lets you load Java code from a URL, as you might guess. Inside that function, there's a hard coded IP address and a file called dl.jar, where when this executes, basically reaches out to this hard coded IP, downloads this other jar file, dl.jar, and then executes it as a new utility class. So that's stage 0. All it does is hard coded IP, grabs malware, runs it. Stage 1 is that
By the way, could I
dl.jar
say
file.
that it grabs malware because they now looked into what dl.jar is, but I would admit at this stage, if you're just looking at code, you would like, I could see almost any program having a URL class loader that goes downloads a blob of information for an update in dl.jar. I could imagine some company naming their little update file. So we know it's malware because now they've analyzed dl.jar, but so far, at least even in the design of how they wrote this stage, at first blush, you could easily confuse this for just some sort of update mechanism that was part of the mod. I don't know.
Yeah, you're right.
Thinking
URL
aloud.
class loader. It is a built-in function. Like it's there for a
Yeah.
purpose to do exactly this. So this on its own isn't like straight up malicious. It's a bit sketchy for a Minecraft
The
mod to do
yeah,
this.
the byte array hiding is
Yes.
the sketchy part.
Yeah. So stage 1 file. First, it makes sure it's the only copy of its own process running. So it checks to see if a process is running. If it is not, it starts that process and names itself that. That's a way where, if you infect multiple mod files in a Minecraft installation, it doesn't spin up 20 different processes trying to do the same thing and potentially colliding. It connects to another hard coded IP address as a command and control address. And it actually had a backup mechanism in case that IP went down, where it connected to a Cloudflare page, which is basically a text file with another list of IPs, where it could use that to update its command and control address. From the command and control connection, it downloads either lib.jar if it's running on Linux, or libwebgl64.jar if it's running on Windows. And it sets them to auto run using either the run registry key in Windows or creates a new service called systemd utility.service on Linux. So that's stage 2. Stage 1 was grabbing the dl.jar. Stage 2 has a way of updating its command and control IP, grabbing a Linux or Windows version, and then setting them to run on startup. Stage 2 then is libjar and webgl.64, whatever, the Windows and the Linux one. They are pretty basic on their own. They've got some more obfuscation, but they're effectively just malware loaders that then call to the same IP address and download client.jar. Client.jar is the actual like malware itself. So this includes the ability to self-propagate to every single .jar file on the file system and inject that original stage 0 into them as a form of persistence. Can steal cookies and account credentials from your web browser. It can replace cryptocurrency wallet addresses on your system clipboard. So if you go to copy something within your clipboard, it'll change it presumably to one under the attacker's control. Can steal Microsoft, Discord, and Minecraft account credentials. And it even adds a Windows shortcut that downloads and executes a script on startup that first checks to see whether Java's installed. And if not, it goes to azul.com and downloads it and runs it, and then re-downloads that stage 1 file, the dl.jar file, and executes it as another form of persistence. So basically, like this thing, True Virus self-replicates to other related files on the system. That actually bit one mod developer where one of their developers was testing just a mod to include in their mod pack. That one was infected. When they tested it and infected all other mods on their system, which they then bundled into their mod pack and then delivered this mod pack full of infected versions of all of them. So that
By the
bit right
way,
there was interesting.
Well, you pointed out at the beginning, how did it first get infected? They claimed they had MFA, so how did it happen? But I mean, this could have been independent of the Minecraft mod community if they just targeted a developer that they knew was working with Java files, maybe for other reasons. If they somehow, hey, try this. Oh, you make this mod. Try this mod that I have you, and they install something and it has a downloader. They get it. Then it infects all their packages, and they happen to be someone committing to the sites that are distributing their mods too. You know what I mean? So it could have, and because you say specifically, this can steal cookies. Once I have the cookie, if you had just logged on to, Bucket 10 minutes ago, your cookie gets me into Bucket without MFA.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct.
There could be a first infection that first got this, and that this was the way they got past MFA and got spread via all the other mod communities.
It certainly fits in line with what the actual malware is trying to do. Clearly, the malware author knows what they're looking for and potentially then how to use what they're trying to steal. So, yeah,
it is.
That is a fair hypothesis.
We haven't seen a lot of viruses like we've definitely seen a lot of worms, things that try to stealth spread to other computers over a network, but not something that's trying to spread to a certain type of common file type on your computer. To be honest, a virus kind of wants to be a worm too. It doesn't just want to be on the files of your computer, but I think the virus's strategy is by infecting multiple files that you might share, it can get off your computer too. So if you're someone that shares jar files, this seems that, unfortunately, this is a good threat actor technique. Maybe virus type malware will come back targeting Java libraries and other common tools.
It makes sense in like this scenario where Java is so dang powerful. The good news in this particular case, so all of the hard-coded command and control IPs, they've all been null routed thanks to abuse reports. Cloudflare's taken down that backup mechanism for it as well. For the most part, I think all of the affected mods have been cleaned up on CurseForge. CurseForge themselves put out a blog post with a detector tool they built for Linux and Windows to look for any of this stage 0 injection anywhere on your computer. They also have a list in that blog post of all of the affected mods in case you happen to be a Minecraft player that does mod your Minecraft. You might want to check that out if you haven't already.
It looks like this activity. Daughter. She is not a modder, but I tried to get into it a while ago, and she recently tried one, I think. So I might have to go check her computer now, Mark. Thanks.
It does sound like the activity originated or started within the last 48 hours as of recording this right now. So if you haven't updated a mod in the last 2 days, you're probably okay. But anyways, yeah, super interesting and very different than the kind of, I don't know, script kiddie-esque hacking or malware you tend to see in the mod community when something gets infected. But
by the way,
if you are a Minecraft player, definitely check it out.
Oh, wait, Mark, before we go to the next topic, I thought one other talking point is just generally mods. I mean, I know we're security experts and this is a security podcast, but you and I are gamers, and I like modding. I think it's pretty darn cool. I've been doing it for a long time. But I think beyond this exact thing, you got to kind of recognize that modding is a risk. I think we talk a lot about for mobile apps, mobile security, you should only download things from first-party repositories from the Apple Store or the Google Play Store, or if you're downloading Linux, download it from the official repository. And modding is fun and good and can be safe if you know what you're doing, but you really are getting software from a third-party repository. And I mean, I don't know what the takeaway is because I don't want to stop modding, but unfortunately, if you're not a coder and you're not actually validating some of these mods yourself, you got to recognize there's risk there. So definitely think about it. If you're a company that has InfoSec policies, gaming may not be something that's business, so you may not expressly tell people they can game on their computer. But even if you think about allowing people to game, you should think about how modding does have security risks, and pay attention at least to the communities to make sure that when they do find booby trap mods like this one,
Yeah, and it is very easy to accidentally end up at a sketchy mod source, and just like sketchy sources for other software, end up with something similar to this attack. Yeah.
Yep. Cool.
So moving on, This story starts on May 31st, where the software manufacturer Progress disclosed a SQL injection vulnerability in their popular file sharing application, MOVEit Transfer. So it is an interesting name. If you're not familiar with MOVEit Transfer, it's used by a lot of rather large organizations as like a file sharing mechanism. Can help share confidential files or at least store and maintain confidential files. So they noted that when they initially released this vulnerability disclosure on the 31st, they said the impact could disclose database structure or contents of the database, or even allow an attacker to delete an entire database. Very basic hallmark SQL injection styles of impacts. Yeah. On June 2nd, though, Mandiant published their own article that described the issue more of a code execution flaw, that they had evidence of being exploited as early as May 27th to deploy web shells on vulnerable systems. So SQL injection, getting access to the database, getting access to the actual database application itself. You can sometimes run system level commands, like commands on the underlying operating system, through that SQL database. So it's not that big of a jump to think if you can get SQL injection, you can potentially run a command.
I might jump ahead. Like, it's been a long time since I made a website with a database backend, but besides the fact that you can run other SQL commands, period, and that is bad, isn't it also possible that, like, your database for your website can be a lot of things? It can be where if people are entering into a forums where you keep the data they enter. It can be if there's a password where you store the hash credentials and the name. But it could also be something that is storing an index of files on your website. So is it possible that even if there was that a pure SQL injection, just by placing a PHP file in the right place in a database, that might be indexing a bunch of things that going to a certain URL on the site just loads that PHP you placed in the database at the right place, and bam, that's why the web shell executes?
It is entirely possible, but man, if you are storing your web,
it would be a silly thing to do.
SQL database.
But we also say it's silly to create websites that don't use, pre-programmed procedures to SQL rather than concoctinating procedures right in your web application. We also say it's silly that you don't have a website guest account and you use the SA, full root SQL Server password for your website. There's a lot of things we tell people not to do that some idiots still do. So I think I'm probably pulling strings. It's probably more the code execution route you're going, but people still do the dumb things we tell them not to.
And I guess, like, giving credit to your hypothesis too, it is a database related to a file transfer application.
Yes, there's files being stored.
Yeah, theoretically, at least, could be. So, anyways, Mandiant found malware web shells being deployed on affected systems. They named the web shell Lemur Loot. Okay.
I guess they didn't like Microsoft, so they're using weird animals tied to, I don't know, gaming drops.
So this web shell, though, they think it's specifically designed to run on systems that use MOVEit Transfer software. So it includes the ability to generate commands for that application.
I know where lemur comes from now. Got to move it.
That probably is it.
That is totally it.
Oh, that's so bad.
It's actually funny, at least. At least we know why they picked a silly name.
Yep. Damn it.
Move it.
Anyways, so the web shell includes the ability to create commands for the MOVEit Transfer software for things like enumerating files and folders.
Every time you say move it, Mark, if you're not watching the YouTube version of our podcast, guys, you're missing out.
For the affected software. Retrieve configuration information of the affected software and create or delete users in the affected software.
What's that software again?
I don't remember. Mandiant believes that the web shell is likely related or used to steal data previously uploaded to the affected software by users.
Man, I've done it. You're never going to say it again, are you?
No, I'm not. Mandiant believes that the activities associated with a threat actor they label Fin11. So if you're not familiar with Fin11, they're the ones responsible for the CLOP ransomware variant. On June 5th, Microsoft published a blog post basically corroborating Mandiant's findings, and that Fin7 were using the affected software vulnerability to deploy CLOP ransomware. So interestingly enough, Microsoft calls Fin11 Lace Tempest, using their new naming convention.
Well, there we go. I brought up Microsoft. It doesn't seem to be working if we still have two names, though.
Exactly. Then on June...
Why there's lemurs? I think there's only one name that's going to stick with me.
On June 7th, CISA and the FBI put out a joint cybersecurity advisory confirming that they had evidence of Fin11 or Lace Tempest, whatever you want to call them, using this affected software vulnerability to deploy crop ransomware via the Lemur Loot web shell. So CISA and FBI, in their alert, if you look it up, they actually have some YARA rules that you can use to threat hunt for some of the known IOCs as well, too, to see if you were affected. A search on Shodan a bit ago found that there were 2,500, MOVEit transfer servers discoverable on the internet. Thank you. So far we've seen, Mandiant, Microsoft, and now CISA and the FBI warning about ransomware being delivered by it. It's not just ransomware. So Zealous, which is a pretty big UK-based HR software manufacturer, they confirmed that their own MOVEit system was compromised, and that payroll data from several customers, including British Airways and the BBC, had been stolen through this vulnerability. The government of Nova Scotia put out a statement recently that some of their citizens' private data may have been stolen by a similar compromise. So this vulnerability seems pretty dang widely impacting across the world.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, you might say that when it comes to ransomware, the CLOP threat actors know how to move it.
Why? Anyways,
I promise this is a kombucha. It's not a beer.
If you happen to be a affected software user, make sure it's not exposed to the internet first and foremost. And if it is, make sure you've installed the latest patches. Use some of Mandiant's and CISA's and FBI's YARA rules and other threat hunting signatures to try and figure out if you've been affected. This feels like just how widely it's propagated. If you have a MOVEit transfer server exposed to the internet and you haven't patched it in the last week, this feels like it's too late situation potentially.
Check it first.
Yes, check it first and then patch or rebuild if you do identify it.
You would think, by the way, if someone's done a Shodan search to find the 2,500 MOVEit servers, this seems like it would leave a very obvious externally exposed indicator with that web shell. So I'm sure there's actually, has anyone, I guess I didn't, does that 2,500 exposed servers, is it literally one with the web shell installed? Because you could craft a Shodan or census search specifically looking for not only that it's open, that it's infected.
My gut tells me that CISA and the FBI didn't want to let you know how many web shells are available for you to go.
Maybe we should. If we look a little closer, we know how to use Shodan.
Especially because in the CISA report, it shows you exactly how the web shell works, including how authentication works in it as well, too. So if you happen to find one,
some access. Yeah.
Correct. So I think that's
more
probably
because
why
you said it could be too late, and I think my question is, if those 2,500 are affected, you're right, it is too late. But maybe the threat actors are not taking over as many as they could. I don't know.
Possible,
but that's why I might look.
Yeah. Either way, if you are a MOVEit transfer customer, it's definitely time to review your system.
Go watch the CGI movie. They're fun.
Moving on to the last bit for this episode. Our good friends at Verizon just released their 2023 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. And I know we've gone through and we were participants in it. I think the last 4 years now we've been participants in helping provide some statistics to go into the report. But this year, I figured we'd go through some of the key findings out of it, at least some of the big, in my opinion, headline generating stats from it, and have a quick Corey, what are your hot takes on these walkthrough on the podcast? So, first stat that I guess there's 3 big ones or 4 big ones from like the main intro of it that seemed interesting. So first off, if you're not familiar with the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, basically they take information about data breaches and security incidents over the course of the year. They try and figure out how it happened, like the category of or tactic or technique the threat actor used to get in. Was it internal, external? Use phishing, malware, hacking, whatever. They break this all out by vertical as well too. So finance and insurance, healthcare, education, and then they display this in their big 60-page report, breaking out all of that. So when it comes to the breaches for the last year, they found 83% of breaches involved a external actor. So the overwhelming majority of breaches are still being caused by outside threat actors. 74% of breaches involved a human element, which I think is actually down from last year's report. If I remember right, last year it was in the upper 70s or so. When they say the human element,
that is one of my hot takes we'll talk about after you finish the 4.
Yeah. Human element, quick description. It's everything from phishing, social engineering, but also human mistakes. Basically, anything a human has done in order to potentially cause the breach intentionally or accidentally. 49% of breaches involved credentials of some sort. And then 24% of breaches involved ransomware, which is actually up from 10% in 2021, the last time they ran that stat. And in fact, it was responsible for nearly a third of all breaches in the education sector specifically. So pause here for a second. Any hot takes, Corey, on those main stats?
I mean, I don't think any of them surprise either of us. I always like whenever we're the CSO office, Mark and I now. If you've followed Mark and I for a long time, we've always been kind of security experts and thought leaders, but we haven't actually had to run the security of WatchGuard until the past years. Before that, we were mostly a research organization and helped with product. And I won't speak for you, Mark. You can let us know if it's the same for you. But I love information security, but to me, the thing that always fascinated me was the technical aspects of it. 0-day attacks, non-user interaction attacks, these technical software vulnerabilities or little tricks you can do to get computers or networks to do things that nobody wants you to do without having to worry about tricking or scamming someone into things. Obviously, social engineering and the human element has been a huge part of security since the beginning of time. But when I was more the security nerd guy, my focus was my personal interest is on the technical stuff. And I'm like, oh, I just have to have this technical control to fix this technical problem, or I have to patch this and I fix this issue. And that is not the security issue at all. Now that we're dealing, that's the freaking easy part. Setting up the right controls, making the right policy, making the smart technical decisions to minimize problems. Don't get me wrong, a lot of people don't do enough there, but that should be the easy part. And I think you can tell me it's the same for you as a real CISO. What we really are human communication people and psychologists. We have to figure out how to get people to do the right thing despite all our protections. We have to get them to stop turning off our protections or finding a way around them or using some external SaaS app that we haven't sanctioned because it wasn't new. So to me, the big stat there, I think insiders are a threat, but the fact that most real attacks are external attackers, no surprise. Breaches involving credentials, we've known that for a long time, and frankly, that's probably tied to the human because there's probably a way that credential was leaked. And ransomware, I'm just bored of. We know it's well done. But the human element one hits me every time. It just reminds me that as an actual acting CSO, we really need to be focused more on the human element, even though the technical place is probably where we started and where we're comfortable and where, ones and zeros always add up to the right thing, so we know the right solution to the problem. But the human element and the psychology around what gets people to do the right thing, even if it's harder, that is a much bigger problem just in general for cybersecurity experts that are actually doing it for their business.
Yeah, well said. Nothing else to add on that one. So you said you're bored of ransomware. There's one ransomware stat I want to throw out here, though.
Sorry, so I didn't mean that we need to go over the stats.
They actually cite the FBI's IC3 report in this section where they note that 93% of all ransomware incidents had no loss. So 93% of the ransomware incidents reported to the FBI last year didn't actually cause any financial loss to the organization.
Meaning they didn't pay the ransom, they had a backup, even if there was a reputation thing that the ransomware authors were trying to do, it didn't really affect them.
Yeah, which is actually, that's way higher than I thought it would have been. That means that we as a world are doing better at having good backup and recovery mechanisms.
We know not paying the ransom is sometimes a tough personal issue, but to me that actually makes me feel better, because I think you and I have said forever that I know it's hard, but not paying the ransom is an important thing of not making this stop, or of making this stop. So the fact that 93% are getting through it without a loss is definitely encouraging.
Yep. For the other 7%, though, the median loss is $26,000, which is up more than double from 2021. In the upper 95th percentile, the losses sit right between 1 million and 2.25 million. So the losses can ramp up, but overall, like 93% of organizations have set themselves up where they suffered a ransomware attack, but they had no loss, at least financially, that they reported to the FBI.
News. By the way, this gets to something that I think I present and you present sometimes too. And I think I hate to spoil it, so I won't go into much detail because it is a point we'll talk about a little later. But in that same IC3 report, I'd say I'm sick of ransomware. It's still important for you guys to know about it because it is still one of the main ways they're trying to monetize. So it's just, we've talked about it for so much. Every one of you listening, you know about it. But the latest thing I get from the ICS report is, even if you look at cybersecurity and even normal media headlines, ransomware is often the focus for everyone. And yet the second part of that IC3 report is, even though, there's no loss, maybe the costs have gone up for people losing money, where they do say most of the financial losses is in business email compromise. Is by the way, usually phishing, basic things that involve a human element. That email security is as old as time, so we don't talk about it as much because it's kind of this known, phishing, we know how to handle that, attachments are bad, the end. But no, according to FBI's IC3, business email compromise is costing at least the US far, far more money, literally billions versus millions compared to ransomware. So I think we'll talk about that later, but let's keep going with the DBIR.
The DBIR. So in the DBIR, to get a little technical, they pointed out Log4j, so the Log4Shell vulnerability specifically that popped up towards the end of 2021, but mostly ramped up into 2022. They highlighted that and said that 32% of all Log4j scanning occurred within the first 30 days of release. And my hot take on that is Log4Shell was a massive vulnerability in that, as a consumer, someone that deploys software, it's extremely difficult to know what logging library your applications are using and thus whether they're vulnerable or not.
Yeah, just as a reminder, you can install Log4j on your own, but for most people, they don't even know what it is. It came with some product they purchased, and that product happens to be using this in the background.
Yeah, and it was a 10 out of 10 code execution vulnerability that was trivial to exploit in vulnerable systems. And so by a large chunk of the scanning for it, so trying to find vulnerable systems occurring within the first 30 days, it shows you don't have a lot of time to identify and jump on critical vulnerabilities like that.
Well, once they go public, you're going to get popped soon. So even back to our last story of those 2,500, MOVEit servers. That's probably why you said you might be already affected, because once it goes public, you'll get popped quick.
Yep. 95% of breaches were financially motivated. Duh. That kind of makes sense.
I'd say state-sponsored actors are the only exception, but of course, actually, there's a couple state-sponsored actors that are going financial on us. But even then, it's still duh. Like, it makes also sense that the espionage-type cybersecurity would really be the low noise compared to the pure volume of what criminals are doing.
Yeah. Let's talk about social engineering for a bit. So, pretexting makes up just over half of all social engineering. Pretexting is like the technical term for basically spear phishing. So, pretending to be someone you know or work with in order to launch that spear phishing attack. Could be a person, could be an organization, whatever.
Or information against you. I mean, pretexting essentially learn something about you, and they're using that bit of information to try to get you to gain their trust. Your trust.
You mentioned business email compromise already. So, as a volume of the total incident data that Verizon looked at, it doubled more in the last year. So, business email compromise is absolutely on the rise, just even in raw volume, which makes sense. And then email still makes up 98% of phishing, though they did note that sometimes a email phish, like the hook, can transition into an other communications method, which I think we've seen regularly at WatchGuard. Like we get emails saying, "Hey, it's Prakash, our CEO. Can you text me at this number?"
Text me or set up a meeting. I will say about that, I think we don't have to worry about it this prediction season, because I think it was a prediction from last year, but we did have one prediction that application, this does suggest smishing, text-based phishing. While I've anecdotally seen it blown up on my own phone, it's still a drop in the bucket. If 98% is email, smishing is still kind of small. But to get back to our prediction from, I think, only 1 year ago, we said that messaging application-based phishing, so think things that look like a text messaging app, but it's like, Facebook
WhatsApp,
Messenger, WhatsApp,
Telegram.
Maybe Telegram's a great option. Even things like Teams, which aren't really purely text, but they act like a texting app. We talked about that amount of that type of phishing going up. And while it may have changed a little bit from before, obviously it's still not significant. So maybe that prediction is still kind of a meh.
Yep. Moving on. So for specific types of breaches, or at least causes, breaches that were caused by errors, they found the majority of them were committed by either developers or systems administrators. So basically, you as the person handling potentially sensitive data are more likely to potentially accidentally leak that data, whether by sending it to the wrong destination, misconfiguring a permissions control around it. Makes sense.
This is a big deal one, though, because to me it makes sense that a developer and system admin, and I don't think they say it clearly, but I think even people in our office, like a CISO office, sometimes are qualify as system admins because we're given privileged access. So I don't know if they need to divide IT-based system admins versus security ones, but it makes sense that that's who bad guys would target, because high privilege, that's the privilege you want. But the flip of that, Mark, I think, is I would whether it's a good expectation or not, I wouldn't expect like the accountant or a salesperson or a support person to have the same security knowledge of knowing what mistakes not to make that I would expect of developers and system admins. So to me, this is kind of surprising. I think actually a lot of people sometimes we unfairly give this example of, if it is a human error, it was some very underprivileged employee clicking on malware in an email, and then the threat actor has to do a lot of privilege and escalation and pivoting to get to the developer system admin rights. But it's not, the mistake was that low privileged user. I expect a little more of developers and system admins, because with that knowledge, they tend to know a little bit more about security, or they at least should with the power they have. So I would say this might change who I would want to train. I think with a lot of security awareness training, I'm like, oh, all the non-technical users, they're the ones I have to focus on. IT guys kind of get it. So training, watch it just for a check mark, but I know it's kind of going to be boring for them. This suggests that they're the problem.
Yeah.
Or I mean, not every they're accidental mistakes too.
Or at least in a position where their mistakes can immediately become a serious issue.
Yeah.
I think is a big
So they
piece
just
of it.
have to have more vigilance. I mean, anyone, even us that know security right, can make an accidental mistake, but it just proves that if you have the privilege, it's like me sending them. If I write something for a publication, I'll edit it 5 times and make sure it's beautiful before I send it. But if I send you a text message, I don't bother
I'm
editing it and
lucky
it
if I
looks
can
like
read it.
crap. Exactly. But as a person that's privileged, if I'm doing quick changes on a network, I have to treat everything like the thing that I edit 5 times before I send it out. So just maybe a good reminder for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Pivoting to the healthcare sector specifically, stat that stood out for me there was 35% of healthcare breaches involved internal threat actors. So not just like a mistake from an internal person, but a actually malicious internal threat actor. That's kind of nuts. 35% is not a small number.
Yeah. It kind of
They,
conflicts with the global one of most breaches are external, but I
yep,
find the verticalization I mean, if you are a healthcare provider, you should pay attention to this. Despite, if you read the global stat and you think it's mostly external threat actors you have to worry about, like Mark says, I would think about. I wonder what about healthcare encourages that.
they specifically pointed out like disgruntled employees as a likely avenue for this. I know the last couple of
Makes
years
sense
have
after
been
the pandemic, yeah.
extremely rough for
Yeah, the
healthcare
poor.
practitioners. And you
Yeah,
could imagine there's, speaking as someone in the family of a healthcare practitioner, you often hear like nurses, as an example, talking down about the administration. So the actual business folks of the hospital, they tend to butt
yeah,
heads, the healthcare providers versus the administration wing. And you could imagine a scenario with a disgruntled like healthcare provider
yeah.
doing something to get back
I'd
at
assume
them.
even with a doctor, well, I'm sure
Yeah.
doctors or someone nurses complain about, a doctor actually takes an oath that I'm here to help people. But the administration, hospitals are not, they're for-profit businesses.
Yep.
Yeah, so the business administration is typically, we're for profit, and the doctors are, nurses are, we've taken an oath to help people. So I could
You
see
can see why
how,
they would butt heads.
yes, for sure.
Um, let's see, focusing on SMBs. So for SMBs, 92% of breaches involved either system intrusions, social engineering, or basic web attack hacks in comparison to all of the other options, including like errors, like one of the ones we highlighted earlier. This is in comparison to 85% for those categories for large businesses. So it seems like for smaller ones, it's primarily like the what I would consider the bread and butter hacking of a malware, network attack, web
Huh.
attack, or social engineering kind of
Maybe it
thing.
talks about the maturity, because when we talked about the human element attack, and I had to remind myself that it's not about technical, it's about people. But then I said, except there's some companies that still just don't get the technical right, even though it's easy. Maybe it has to do with money and maturity. If you don't have the people to put the security, you're messing up the easy part, which is the 101 technical. So you
Yeah.
certainly don't have time for the human. But the larger businesses have at least got the maturity to figure out the technical part. So that's why maybe they drop
Yeah,
down in the
that could make
basic
sense.
stuff and human hits them more.
For SMBs, the majority of breaches resulted in compromised credentials. So, like the actual data stolen, whereas credentials. Uh, whereas only 37% of breaches resulted in stolen internal data. On the flip side, for larger businesses, 41% were internal data and only 37% were stolen credentials. So it seems like when you're targeting a small business, maybe their crown jewels aren't worth as much, but their user credentials are
Yeah,
still
it
worth
totally
quite a
makes
bit.
sense. It's
Yep.
actually, if it makes sense with the story, we used to tell SMBs why they're the I mean, the SMB would say, I'm not Coca-Cola. I don't have the formula to Coca-Cola. No one wants to steal my data. I just sell noodles to my customers at a restaurant. And that's why you don't have to worry about them stealing your internal data.
I've had
But
some
wait a
pretty dang
second.
good noodles.
That's true. I'm oversimplifying, but you know what I
Yeah.
mean. But that faux restaurant has credit cards and probably passwords associated with the people that log into the till. So no matter if you're big or small, you might have credentials of your own employees and your users that do.
Yep.
It all checks out,
And then finally wrapping up, they
anecdotally as
actually
well as statistically.
checks out anecdotally. They ended the report by just...
They provide the hard, quantifiable analytics. By the way, we helped them with a few of our own. And I supplied this anecdotal information with no backing whatsoever, Mark.
Yep, exactly, as is tradition. So they talk about specific CIS controls that they recommend organizations implement. Starting with small business, they focused on Control 14, which is security awareness and skills training, Control 11, which is data recovery, and Control 5, which is access control management. They said those will cover the majority of the data breaches that they had reported.
Human element for the first, ransomware recovery so you don't have to pay for the second, and getting rid of the basic stuff that SMBs suffer for the third.
And then when you go up to a mid-size enterprise, though, the three you should focus on are 17, which is incident response management, 16, which is application software security, and 18, which is penetration testing. And those
you guys got the basics done, so you better have a SOC by now.
Exactly. So overall, like, the report's great. They do a good like landing page, splash page kind of thing with an executive summary if you don't feel like reading 77 pages worth of breach data. But even just skimming it, you'll find some interesting stuff related to your specific vertical in there as well, too. Definitely check out.
As much as I joke about anecdote, I really respect this report. It's not just Verizon takes the Herculean task of gathering tons of data, but it truly is if you look at the contributors to this report, there's many vendors from many industries. So it is quantifiable data. So it's a great report for sure. Definitely check it out. At the very least, read the executive summary.
And coming soon, WatchGuard's Internet Security Report. Maybe we'll be chatting about that on a very future soon, upcoming podcast.
I need to find a way. I think the security story of the month, which we won't have this quarter, but if we do, it should be on MOVEit, Mark.
Okay, whatever. End it. Kill it.
With fire.
Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can still reach out to us on Twitter. I have not canceled my account yet, but we're getting pretty close. I'm at XORRO_. Corey is at SecAdept, and the both of us are at hashtag the 443 podcast. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.
I like to move it.
Ugh.